everybody. I'm Jay Scherr with Jay Scherr Business Consulting. We help entrepreneurs, business owners, and other leaders maximize their potential, build rock-solid foundations for their businesses, and create more freedom in their lives. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Maya Angelou said, "If we lose love and self-respect for each other, this is how we finally die." Well, on today's episode, we're going to talk about the meaning of radical respect, fostering a culture of respect in the workplace, what gets in the way of radical respect, the two frameworks we need to address these issues, and more. My guest is a wife and mother, a New York Times bestselling author, speaker, and co-host of a top-rated management podcast. She was a CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and other tech companies. She was a member of the faculty at Apple University, which Steve Jobs established to educate Apple employees about what makes Apple, Apple. Before that, she led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick teams at Google. Earlier in her career, she managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. I think we need to explore that a little bit in this conversation. Please welcome the woman who's taught us how to be a kick-ass boss without losing our humanity and is now providing us an essential guide for how to work together better, Kim Scott. Kim, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to our conversation all week.
As am I, and thank you so much again for being here. This is going to be a fantastic conversation, so let's dive right in. I thought first, to kick things off, maybe a good starting point would be for you to share with all of us what your favorite thing is about yourself and why that particular thing.
Well, I was talking to I have twins who are 15. I was talking to them the other day, and they said that they thought that my favorite thing about myself was that I really don't care what other people think of me. Not that I don't care about other people. I really do care about other people, but I don't care that much about what they think of me. I'm gonna say what I think in a way that shows them that I care.
That's incredible. Now, I would like to say the same thing about myself, but the truth is that even though I may say I don't care, I really do care, right? There are times I find myself caring more than I wish I cared.
Yeah.
So in your world, do you truly, are you really at a place in life where it makes no difference what other people either say or think about you? And have you always been that way, or is this something that you've cultivated over time?
Yeah. The TLDR is I don't know, but I think that this is in some ways, as many strengths are. In some ways, this is a strength, and sometimes this has hurt me. This trait. I remember at one point I was in a series of very bad romances. And I was seeing a therapist about this, and he asked me, I was in a bad relationship, and he asked me if this man really cared about me, and that was a question I had never asked myself. So that was
an interesting question.
That's the dark side. Like I should have asked. Like it should have been one of the first things I asked myself about someone if I'm going to start to date them. Like, do they care about me? And for some reason, I was just all I was thinking about. It was almost, it was almost selfish. I was like, how do I feel about him? That was my main concern. And so I think it's actually important to care what other people think. And I've had to actually learn to do it, to a certain extent. I think that part of the reason, like if you criticize me and I think your criticism is totally off base It doesn't bother me at all. If you criticize me and I think you're correct in your criticism, then I care about what you say, but I'm also grateful to you because now I know about a problem that I can fix. And so I don't know why I am this way, but but I sort of am.
So it's like, why question it? Go with it. But it's good that you have the self-awareness around it. So I just want to pull on
I will question the criticism. I'll question if I think it's right or if it's wrong.
Okay.
And if I think you're wrong in your criticism, then I'm able to just tell you I think you're wrong. And it doesn't bother. It doesn't bother if I think you're right, then I pay more attention to it. Not because I'm mad at you for telling me, but because I'm grateful to you for telling me about something that I can then fix. I think I learned this from my grandmother, actually.
Really? So
Yes.
tell me more about that. What was it that your grandmother either showed you, taught you? Was it learned through a lesson? What was it?
It was a lesson. I had told a lie, and my grandmother came down like a ton of bricks on me because for her, honesty was a core value, as for a lot of people. And I was upset. I was crying because she had sort of gotten upset with me. And she sat me down and she said, Kim, I didn't tell you that you did the wrong thing because I don't love you. I told you because I do love you. And if you can listen to people's criticism and decide if you think they're right and make a change if you think they are right, then that will stand you in good stead for the rest of your life. And so it's not exactly that I don't care what people think of me. But if they think badly of me and I know why, then I can change it and I'm glad. And if they think badly of me and I think they're wrong, then I can dismiss them.
That makes perfect sense. And what a great lesson to learn from your grandmother. That's a very powerful one.
Yes, that was a big one.
Yeah, that's huge. So I want to just go back for a moment to something that you had said when you brought up therapy. So when you were going through therapy, or maybe you still are, I'm a big advocate for therapy.
Yes, big advocate.
Yeah. So what were you learning about yourself as you were starting this journey, whether it's self-discovery, resolving issues, whatever it was? What were you learning about yourself?
I think one of the reasons why I write books, and also one of the reasons why I think therapy is so helpful, is that I'm always curious, what are the things that I could do that are going to move me in a direction that is going to make me both happier and more productive? And what are the things that I do that are self-destructive? And we all do these self-destructive things, and often we're not aware. I mean, I think if we were aware they were self-destructive, we still might keep doing them because we don't know how to stop doing them sometimes. And so that's what I felt like I was sabotaging myself. And so I wanted to figure out what I was doing wrong, why I was doing it, and most importantly, how to stop doing it.
Makes a lot of sense. So did you, the tools that you learned, did you actually put them into practice? I would think so, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Okay, good.
Well, I got out of that bad romance. I moved across the country and I met Andy Scott, who became my husband. So
there you go.
Yes. And we're happily married 17 years later.
Love it. With twins.
With twins.
With twins.
15,
Yep. How fantastic is that? Now, just from a curiosity perspective, are there twins on either side, you or your husband?
There are twins on both sides, but these twins had some help from science. We'll say. We were 40 when we got married, so we did not get married young.
Thank goodness for a modern technology and science.
Yes, thank goodness for IVF.
Yes, there you go. Wonderful. So I would love it if you would just share, maybe give us a snapshot of how you ended up in Kosovo. I'd love to hear that story. And then also as I mentioned at the opener about you starting a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. Where did this come from?
Yeah. So let's start with the diamond cutting factory. I studied Russian literature and also studied sort of arms control in college. And I graduated from college in 1990. And in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And it appeared at that time that all the problems I was solving had resolved themselves. And so I moved to Moscow, and I was initially being paid $6 a month to do a study on military conversion, swords into plowshares. So that was my first job. In fact, my first job letter said, "We know this doesn't sound like a big salary, but don't worry, there's nothing to buy here anyway."
Oh my gosh.
That was my introduction to the workforce. So I moved to Moscow, and then it turned out that there was a company called Battery March Financial Management that was investing U.S. pension fund dollars in these Soviet defense facilities that were converting from military to civilian production. So like a tank factory that was starting to make tractors for the newly privatized small farms. So that was how I started my career in Russia. And then the coup happened in 1991, and Battery March pulled the money out of Russia, invested it in China, but I wanted to stay in Moscow. So like all things, like all jobs, through a friend of a friend, I got a job for a U.S.-based diamond company and started up this diamond cutting factory in Moscow, which was actually my first management experience.
No kidding.
Yeah.
And so how long did you have this diamond cutting factory? And since it was your first experience in management, how would you view how you showed up as a manager at that time? And what was maybe just one of the most valuable or important management lessons you learned from those days?
Yeah. This was actually the moment when I realized management was interesting. As I mentioned, I had studied Russian literature. I had no interest in business whatsoever. I was interested in Russian literature and peace. And when I was asked to hire these Russian diamond cutters, I thought it was going to be easy. This was 1991, and the ruble was collapsing, and I was going to pay them in dollars. And so I thought, that's all business is about, money. How hard can it be? And
Sure.
So I went to talk to these guys, and they were almost all guys. There was one woman. So I went to talk to these people, and they said, the salary is not enough. Before we take the job, we want to have a picnic with you. It's like, all right, well, I can do a picnic too. That's something I can do. And by the time we finished a bottle of vodka, I realized that the thing that I could do that the state could not do for them was to give a damn at a very human level. And that was the moment when I realized that being a manager is about building good relationships with people. And that was the moment when I thought, oh, it's interesting. Management is actually interesting.
That's so good. And okay, so this is 1991. So how long were you actually there? And then what brought you back to the U.S., or did you go to the U.S. from Russia?
I did go back to the U.S. So I was there from 90 to 94. So I lived there for 4 years. Interesting. They were an interesting 4 years to be there. By 1994, it became clear that what was happening in Moscow was dangerous and chaotic. I remember there was a moment when one bank that was competing with another bank, but these were really sort of more mafioso types than what we think of as bankers. They beheaded their competitors and set them up on stakes in the suburbs of Moscow. And that was when I decided it's time for me to leave. I'm out of here.
Good move. Good move.
Yeah. And so I went to business school. I went I figured that's what I'll do next. Now that I know that management is interesting, I'll go learn more about it. And of course, I got to business school, and how many classes did I take on managing people? Zero. None. They didn't. This is not something they teach at business school.
By the way, this was at Harvard Business School, by the way.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So 0 classes on relationships, building good relationships with people.
Yeah. Or
Okay.
managing people, like the basics. What do managers do? I think most business school students could not answer that very basic question, unfortunately. Yeah.
So true. That's incredible. Okay, so let's keep going with the timeline here. So you graduate from Harvard Business School. You've got your master's now. What happens with you? Where do you go? And where do you want to go? What is life looking like?
Yeah. So I mean, I had a very strange reason for going to business school. I wanted to subsidize my novel writing habit. Like, I was still interested in the big fat Russian novels, and also in writing my own novels, also in American literature. I did a lot of both. And I wanted to do something that I found interesting. Like, I wanted to do something that might give me some grist for the writing mill. And so I was the only person in my class that took a job in the federal government. I left Harvard Business School and I went to work at the Federal Communications Commission. Because this was 1994, like, there was the telecommunications revolution. And it was interesting. There were a lot of people who had worked in Russia, Americans who had worked in Russia, now working at the FCC. People who were interested in big changes, I think.
Really?
Yeah, it was kind of a strange coincidence that I didn't expect. Yeah, there you go. And I really enjoyed working there in many ways at the FCC. My boss was Reed Hunt. He was a wonderful mentor. A person who I really enjoyed working with, learned a ton from. He taught me really important lesson, which is you need, as a young person early in your career, to be willing to ask for help. Don't think of it as looking for a handout, but asking for help is like looking for an investment in yourself. And when someone invests in you, then they're your champion, and it's much more likely that you'll go on to be successful. So there you go.
That's so good. And I'm going to hit pause for just a moment, because all of you that are watching and listening right now, I hope you heard that, because, I mean, if there is one area that I see so many people being afraid of, it is the willingness to ask for help.
Yes.
If we could just learn that,
yeah.
Think about how far we can go. And the interesting thing is, and you I'm sure you found this with Reed, when you learn to ask, people are always willing to lend a hand, right? To give you a hand up, not necessarily a hand out, but a hand up, right? Let me teach you some new skill, something that's going to help you become better at what you do and help set you up for success.
Yeah. It's so true. It has been one of the biggest, pleasantest surprises of my life, is the extent to which, when you ask for help, people are really genuinely happy to give it to you. And that's a great way to build wonderful relationships, to find mentors, to find friends. Sometimes sometimes you become the mentor of the person who is mentoring you. It's just wonderful.
Love that. That is so good. All right, so we're moving into the world of business, but with an underlying reason behind it, to subsidize our novel writing.
Yes.
And by the way, you have written a number of novels, which I think is so interesting, and I want to ask you about that. But what I'm curious is what is the difference, if there is a difference, the way that you think and the way that you process when writing a novel versus writing a book like Radical Candor or a book like Radical Respect. How do you show up differently?
I think that one of the reasons why those books have been helpful to people is that I brought that storytelling. to these books. If you're writing a novel, you're really focused on storytelling, but you're also often, at least when I write a novel, I'm also interested in conveying some ideas. So the difference between a novel and a book of nonfiction, a book like Radical Candor or Radical Respect, is that, first of all, I have a framework. And I have a framework that makes it easy, I hope anyway. My goal is to make it easy to capture a big idea in a simple way. So that's part of, and that is usually true in a novel, but it's implicit, not explicit. In a book like Radical Candor or Radical Respect, the framework is very explicit. And then I explain the framework with the stories that I tell. So if you think about the framework as I don't want to say a Christmas tree because that's not inclusive, a Festivus pole. The stories are like ornaments that you hang on the Festivus pole. And then you also need to do a third thing, which you don't do in a novel, which is give people practical, tactical tips for how to put this idea into practice. So you've got the framework that helps you remember the idea. You've got the stories that help illuminate the idea. And then you need to offer these practical, tactical tips for how to put the idea into practice in your life, how to make the idea real.
Beautifully said. And by the way, thank you for the Festivus pole reference in the Seinfeld
Yes.
piece there.
Festivus for the rest of us.
For the rest of us, yeah, you planted an image in my mind that I'm having difficulty getting away from now. So
that's what I try to do in my books as well. That's the benefit of a story and a metaphor, right?
And you do it so beautifully and so well. So and we're going to talk more about that here in a moment. So let's. I didn't mean to get us off track, but I had to ask a couple of those questions. So let's go. So we're with the FCC. So let's kind of pull the timeline forward a bit.
Okay.
So what happens once you decide to leave the FCC?
Yeah. So I did several startups. I joined several startups after the FCC, and then I founded my own startup. Which was called Juice Software. Nobody's ever heard of it, and that's okay because Juice failed. And it was, whenever you start a company and it doesn't succeed, that is hard. But much harder than the business failure was the sort of, in some ways, it felt like the failure of a dream. Because one of the things that I was trying to do at Juice was to create a radically respectful company, even though I didn't have those words to name it at the time. And I sort of imagined, and this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but I think a lot of other leaders make this same mistake. I imagined that if I were in control, if I were the founder and the CEO or the co-founder and the CEO, then all this other bullshit that had happened at all these other places where I had worked wouldn't happen. And of course it did happen. It did. All the bullshit happened, even though I was in charge. And that was very demoralizing to realize. But I think there's an important lesson there, which is that it's not enough to be a good person as a leader. You need to learn how to build good management processes, to think sort of systematically about how you're going to set up your company. Because if you don't think about those things very systematically, then the result is going to be systemic injustice every single time. And so after the company, we sold the company, sell being a very generous term for what actually happened, I took a job at Google. And that worked out much better. It worked out much better from the business point of view, but the job at Google was also almost like a resurrection of a dream for me, because Google had created, I mean, it wasn't perfect, and a lot of people had bad experiences even early on at Google, but I had a really great experience at Google because Google had built the kind of environment that I had tried and failed to create at Juice. There was the leader of business operations at Google, Shona Brown, had very systematically built the management systems at Google to make sure that no leader, even the founders and the CEO, had unlimited power, had unilateral decision making power over who got hired, how much people got paid, who got promoted, who got fired, and so on. So she really built systems that created checks and balances. Checks and balances are really important in a political system. They're also important in a business. So she created those checks and balances, and that created a much better work environment. Leaders at Google could not, no manager at Google could kind of rely on command and control. They had to manage in a very different way. And the other thing that the systems at Google did was they measured what mattered. They quantified bias at every stage of the employee life cycle. And when the measurements indicated that bias might be influencing the decisions over who got fired, who got hired, who got promoted, then they asked the next level questions and they tried to improve the system. So that was, and it was a great working environment for me anyway.
That sounds like a remarkable experience.
Yeah. Yes,
to have all of that put into practice and seeing this brought to life.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of quantifying bias, as you were involved and as you learned about these systems and the processes that they were using, did you see anything in those processes, especially relating to bias, that you thought could be improved upon?
Oh, sure.
Was it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was not perfect. Believe me, it was absolutely not perfect. I mean, at one point when I was at Google, someone got promoted not one but two levels ahead of me. And when the note went out about why this person had been promoted, the note said the size of his business, smaller than the size of the business I was managing, the growth of his business, slower than the growth of the business that I was managing, and the number of people that he had managing this business, which was more than the people I had managing a bigger, faster growing business. And I was like, this doesn't seem quite fair, and I went and I talked to the HR people who were making that decision, and they said, well, he's got a bigger span of control. In other words, he's hired more people. I'm like, you mean he's leading a less profitable business, right? and I made no progress with them. So they tried. They didn't always succeed, and that was frustrating and other people had much worse experiences than that. But they at least tried, which is more than any other company where I had ever worked had done.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So we go from Google. You take these experiences that you've learned, and also the failures that you had in the startup, right? So you're learning, yes, and you're growing throughout this whole process. So what transpires next for you? And if you could, what's happening in terms of your writing at this stage? Were you writing novels? Were the seeds there for you to write either Radical Candor or at least thinking about that business book?
Yeah. So I was writing a novel, which never got published, but I did self-publish. It's called Virtual Love. So I wrote that novel while I was working at Google. But I think the seeds of Radical Candor were getting very firmly planted at the same time. I think the big thing that I learned at Google is one of the stories I tell all the time about Radical Candor. And this happened shortly after I joined. I was going into a meeting with the founders and the CEO, and I had to explain how the AdSense business, which I was leading at the time, was doing. And I walked into the room, and there in one corner of the room is one of the founders on an elliptical trainer, stepping away, wearing toe shoes and a bright blue, super tight unitard. Not what I was expecting or wanting to see in the room, frankly. And there in the other corner of the room is the CEO doing his emails, like his brain has been plugged into the machine. So probably like you in such a situation, I felt a little bit nervous. Like, how was I supposed to get these people's attention? Right. Luckily for me, the AdSense business was on fire. And when I said how many new customers we had added over the last couple of months, the CEO almost fell off his chair. What did you say? This is incredible. Do you need more marketing dollars? Do you need more engineers on the project? So I'm feeling like the meeting's going all right. In fact, I now believe that I'm a genius. And I walked out of the room. I walked past my boss, and I'm expecting a high five or a pat on the back. And instead, she says to me, why don't you walk back to my office with me? And I thought, oh, wow, I screwed something up in there, and I'm sure I'm about to hear about it. And she began not by telling me what I had done wrong in the meeting, but what had gone well in the meeting. Not in the shit sandwich sense of the word, but really seeming to mean what she said. Okay. And am I allowed to curse on your podcast, by the way?
You already did,
okay.
So the answer is yes.
Did. Okay. And of course, I didn't really want to hear about what had gone well. All I wanted to hear about was what I had done wrong. Eventually, she said to me, you said a lot in there. Were you aware of it? And with this, I kind of made a brush off gesture with my hand. I was like, yeah, I know. It's no big deal. It's a verbal tic. And then she said to me, I know this great speech coach. I bet Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction? And once again, I made this brush off gesture with my hand. I said, I'm busy. Didn't you hear about all those new customers? I don't have time for a speech coach. And then she stopped. She looked me right in the eye and she said, I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid. Now she's got my full attention. And some people might say it was mean of her to say I sounded stupid because that's harsh. It seems harsh. But in fact, it was the kindest thing she could have done for me at that moment in my career, because if she had not used just those words with me, and by the way, this is a really important point, she would never have used those words with other people on her team who were a better listener than I was. But she knew me well enough to know that if she didn't use just those words with me, that I wouldn't go visit the speech coach. And she also knew me well enough to know that if she used those words with me, it wasn't going to crush me, it was going to be okay. And so I went to visit the speech coach, and I learned that she was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. And this was news to me because I had raised money for 3 different startups, giving presentations to venture capitalists. I thought I was pretty good at giving presentations. It was suddenly like I realized at that moment that I'd been charging through my whole career with a giant hunk of spinach between my teeth, and nobody had had the common courtesy to tell me it was there. Wow. And so this got me to thinking, first of all, why had no one told me? And second of all, what was it about my boss's management style that made it so seemingly easy for her to tell me? And I realized in the case of her management style, it boiled down to 2 things that seemed pretty basic. She cared personally and she challenged directly at the same time. And that might seem basic, and yet it's rare. It's so rare that I call it radical candor. And as I mentioned, I went to business school where I learned nothing about managing people, but I did learn at business school that all of life's hardest problems can be solved by a good 2x2 framework. And so this is my feedback framework. On the vertical line is care personally. On the horizontal line is challenge directly. And when you do both, it's radical candor. When you challenge, but you forget to show you care, that's obnoxious aggression, which is very different from radical candor. When you do neither, that's manipulative insincerity, which is the worst of all worlds. If obnoxious aggression is front stabbing, manipulative insincerity is backstabbing. But those are the mistakes we maybe talk a lot about, but not the most common mistake. In my experience, the most common mistake that people make is what happens in this last quadrant, in the upper left-hand quadrant, where you do remember to show that you care personally, but you're so worried about not hurting someone's feelings or not offending them that you fail to say something they'd be better off knowing in the long run. And that's what I call ruinous empathy. Yes, you and me both.
Been there there many a time.
Me too.
And it wasn't spinach in the teeth.
No, it's things that matter a lot more,
Yes.
that wind up getting people fired. It's painful.
It is very painful. So for all of you that are watching and listening right now, Radical Candor is a book if you have not already read this book, we already know who wrote the book. If you
Yes.
haven't read this book, you need to run out to buy a copy immediately. Obviously, we're going to put a link in the show notes. And the intent of this conversation is to really shift and talk about radical respect.
Yes.
But there's a tie to radical candor that leads to radical respect. So, first of all, Kim, I appreciate you sharing kind of really the genesis of radical candor, but I want to make sure that this isn't lost on everyone that's watching and listening right now, because it is an important step for all of us to learn how we can have these kinds of conversations, why it's so important. And you're going to see the 2x2s. I mean, to Kim's point, she does love 2x2s.
I do love a good 2x2.
She definitely does. So here's what I would love for us to do if we can. And you open Radical Respect with a really interesting story that really ties to radical candor. So share that story, because radical candor it's about feedback, right?
Yes, yeah.
You get a powerful piece of feedback, and I want to hear from you. What did that mean to you, and how did it change your life and open your eyes?
Yeah, if you write a book about feedback, as you say, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed I did. And hands down, the most helpful feedback that I got, the feedback that caused me to sit down and write Radical Respect, came when I was giving a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And I was really excited to do this talk because the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade. She's a person I like and respect enormously. And she's one of too few Black women CEOs in tech, or frankly, in any other sector. And when I finished giving the Radical Candor talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor here. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture that I want to build. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would give people even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, that they would call her an angry Black woman. And as soon as she said it to me, I knew it was true. I could think of times when it had happened, and I knew how unfair it was because she's one of the most even-keeled, cheerful people I'd ever worked with. And as soon as she said this to me, I had 4 different realizations at the same time. And these 4 different realizations became kind of an organizing principle for Radical Respect about the roles that all of us play all the time and how we can play them better. So the first thing that I realized was that I had failed to be an upstander. I had been kind of a silent bystander when this had happened to her. And that is not who I want to be. That is not how I see myself. That's not my goal, is to be a silent bystander.
All right, so just so we're clear on that, define upstander. We know what a bystander is, but give us your definition of what an upstander is.
An upstander is someone who intervenes when they notice something bad happening, when they notice a disrespectful attitude or behavior happening to someone else. And I hadn't even taken into account the toll it must take on her to have to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we were ever in together. So that was number one. I'd failed to be an upstander. The second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her, I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that happened to me as a woman in tech. And so as a person who was harmed by disrespectful attitudes or behaviors, I never chose a response. Instead, I just pretended it wasn't happening. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I had been in denial. And I think I did that because I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. But even less than wanting to think of myself as the victim, did I want to think of myself as the culprit. So the third thing I realized was that I had been most deeply in denial about the times when I was the one who had the disrespectful attitude or behavior that made it harder than it needed to be for my colleagues to get their jobs done. And, my job was to become part of the solution, not part of the problem. My job was to make amends. to apologize and make amends. But I couldn't, of course, do that if I was pretending that, if I was in denial about the problem. And the fourth thing, this was a big moment for me. The fourth thing that I realized was that the kind of leader that I aspire to be is a leader who creates these BS-free zones where everybody can do the best work of their life and enjoy working together. But of course, by being in denial about these disrespectful attitudes and behaviors that were making themselves manifest on my team, both, by the way, that was kind of what happened at Juice Software, but it also happened later at Google, unfortunately, in other situations as well. I was failing to prevent these attitudes and behaviors from disrupting my team's ability to get stuff done. So that was a big drink of water, but it was also, in some ways, a huge gift, because denial is like a burden that we carry around with us. It's like an elephant, not in the room, but on our back. And like sitting down to write this book was my way to get that elephant off my back.
Amazing. So big moment, like you said, and I think it's so interesting how you think so deeply, right? How you were able to really distill and start to think about how each of these different areas not only impacted this Black woman who who provided this feedback, who you care about, right? But also that you did the internal reflection, and that you were able to identify, I can see, right? I make the correlation here. This has been me.
Yeah.
And
we all have done this. Like,
absolutely.
I'm not alone. Unfortunately, I'm in really good company, like with everyone in the world.
And it also kind of speaks to, and I hear this from a lot of different authors that I have the benefit of interviewing, that the book that author wrote, they wrote for themselves, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they wrote it for others, but they wrote it for themselves because it was the book they needed.
Yes, yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yes.
It's like therapy, but hopefully it's therapy where I learn something that I can share with other people so that they learn the easy way what I had to learn the hard way by screwing up.
Absolutely. So, first of all, you've already shared some amazing information here, but I would love it if we could talk about, for just a moment or two, you go much deeper in your book, Radical Respect, but for those business leaders who are listening right now, who this is landing with them, right? They're listening to this conversation and they're thinking, oh my gosh, I know I'm doing this, right? Oh boy, this is a big one.
Yeah.
So where do we get started, right? How do we begin to develop or foster a culture of respect? So let's just kind of walk through some of the things that we can do, some of the things that we can actually implement immediately.
Yeah. I think it's important to think about what gets in the way of radical respect. But before we think about the problems, I want to spend just a second on the goal, positive target identification, right?
Okay.
I was talking to a fighter pilot who said, if you're trying to fly through the mountains, you want to stay focused on the gap through the mountains, not the mountain you don't want to hit. So what is radical respect, first and foremost? When I'm talking about radical respect, I'm talking about a particular definition of respect, because respect, the word, has two different definitions. One definition of respect is something that one has to earn. So in order to earn your respect as a writer, I have to write books that you read and like, right? So, but that's not what I'm talking about. The other definition of respect is sort of unconditional respect. It's the regard that I owe you and that you owe me for our shared humanity. It's the regard that we have for other people's backgrounds, for the emotions, for who they are and how they're showing up. And that kind of unconditional respect doesn't mean that we can't disagree. Of course we can disagree. It doesn't mean that we can't hold someone accountable for making a mistake. Of course we can, and we must do that, especially as leaders. But it does mean that we have to show that person that kind of unconditional respect while we are disagreeing with them, while we are holding them accountable. And so how do we get to that kind of radical respect? I think we need to do two things. We need to optimize for collaboration rather than coercion. I believe that hierarchy is necessary, but we want a collaboration hierarchy, not a dominance hierarchy. If we were animals, then we would need a dominance hierarchy. But we are people and we can communicate really well, so we get to have collaboration hierarchies. And frankly, even animals and plants have collaboration hierarchies. So it's unfair for me to say this is only a human thing. Like trees collaborate with one another. Who knew?
They all have their own way of communicating.
Yes, they do, which we don't understand. So we want to, because there's so much research that has been done that demonstrates that command and control is not a great way to lead a company. You're not going to get the most innovative results out of people. You're not going to get the best results out of people with command and control. So you want a collaboration. You want to optimize for collaboration. And at the same, so that's the vertical line. The horizontal line is honoring individuality. Nobody that I've ever met really wants to work in a dystopic 1984 style, everybody's marching in lockstep kind of environment where we're demanding conformity. And yet sometimes we do demand conformity when it is our intention to honor individuality. So radical respect is really a kind of workplace where the strength of the team is the individual and the strength of the individual is the team. You don't have to choose between individuality and collaboration. You get both. So that's
it's one and the other together.
Yes, one and the other. So
Perfect.
that's what I mean by radical respect. Now, given that pretty much everybody wants this, why doesn't it always happen? It rarely does happen. So what gets in the way? A million things get in the way, but I'm going to boil it down to three. The three big ones: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think that one of the problems here is that we often conflate these three problems as though they're one problem. But they're actually three very different problems. And so, one of the things that people in Silicon Valley, where I spent most of my career, love to do is they love to solve hard problems. So this is a hard problem. And the first step in solving a hard problem is breaking it down into its component parts. So there's tons more to be said about this, but I want to offer some simple definitions for bias, prejudice, and bullying so that we can distinguish between them and figure out what to do about them. Bias is not meaning it. When I talk about bias, I'm talking about unconscious bias.
Okay.
Prejudice, on the other hand, is meaning it. Prejudice is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And bullying is not about belief. Bullying is just about being mean, right? And so if bias is not meaning it, prejudice is meaning it, and bullying is being mean, what can we do as leaders to prevent these things from destroying our team's ability to collaborate and to honor each other's individuality? I think, go ahead.
Kim, I just want to say one thing here because I can just imagine that some people who are listening to you sharing this right now are probably thinking to themselves, this doesn't happen in my organization.
I'm going to call bullshit on that.
As am I. And I know that once it's kind of like we don't know what we don't know, right?
Yeah.
But when you start to have the sense of awareness, you're going to see things that this is going to become,
them.
Oh my gosh. And so I'm just asking everyone, I get it that you want to put up a wall, right? I get it, but just pay attention and listen and be aware that this is happening. And now you're going to find out how and what you can do about it. Sorry about that. Keep going, Kim.
No, I think you're exactly right, because we cannot fix problems we refuse to notice. And these problems are really hard to notice because this is sort of what happened to me at Juice. I thought I was creating this great work environment. I certainly had every good intention of creating this great work environment. But because I refused to notice the way that bias, prejudice, and bullying were showing up, I allowed them to keep showing up. And I think part of the reason that I didn't notice, that I was in denial, is because it it felt so shameful for me to think that I had started a company where this, and it was easy to, like, my intentions are, so how could I be creating a hostile work environment for women? I am a woman, and yet it happened. And so I get it. It is really hard to notice this stuff, but again, imagine if you stood up in front of your shareholders and you said, well, I intended to be profitable this quarter. Like, they don't care. It's impact that matters, not good intentions. Good intentions, especially if you're a leader, are not, they're important, but they're not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient. So one of the things that I think can really help is to think about, what can we say when we don't know what to say? I think another part of the reason why we don't notice bias, prejudice, and bullying in a meeting is that you don't know what to say when you do notice it. And so you say nothing. And the problem is that by saying nothing, we then ensure that it's going to happen again. We've got to notice the problems in order to fix them. So if you think it's bias, that you've noticed like something doesn't feel quite right and you think it's bias, I recommend using an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. One of my favorite stories about an upstander and he was not, in this case, a leader. He was an upstander, and he was being an upstander for his boss. So this friend of mine, who's a woman, and who was at a small company, was going in to meet with a really big company. It was a very important partnership they were trying to develop, a deal they were trying to win. Mm-hmm. And so she and her two employees, who were men, walked into this big, long conference room with a table, one of those tables for like 60 people. And she sat down at the center of the table because she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal, and also because she was the leader of that team. And when the other side came in, the first person didn't sit across from her. He sat across from the guy next to her. And then the next person came in and sat across from the guy next to him. And then everybody else filed on down the table. And you're nodding because you've noticed this happen before.
I have. So she's isolated. No one's with her.
Dangling alone at the end of the table. And also her team is 3 people, and the other team has like 15 people in the room. So she starts talking, and when the other side has questions, they direct them at her two employees, who are men. You've seen this happen. You've noticed this happen too, I'm guessing. So it happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time. And finally, one of these guys stands up and he says, I think we should switch seats. That was all he had to do. So he put her at the center now. That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. Because as soon as he did that, the other side realized what they were doing, and they stopped doing it. They didn't mean it. It was bias. And why did he do that? He did that partly because he wanted to win the deal. So there's a very practical, hard-nosed reason to do this. He also did it because he liked her, and it bothered him to see her get ignored. So there's kind of an emotional reason to do it. And thirdly, he did it because he knew that it was going to be easier for them to hear it from him than from her. It wasn't that he thought she couldn't speak up for herself, but he knew that it was going to be easier for these, and all 15 people on the other side were men, although certainly women can be biased too. But it was going to be easier for them to hear it from him than to hear it from her. And so those are 3 good reasons to be an upstander. But
that's such a great, I just want to pause for 1 second, because that's a great example of an upstander in action. Yeah. And, as you're describing this, it almost, I can feel it in my chest, because I've seen those situations before. And I got to tell you, I've been in a setting like that before, and I didn't say anything, right?
It's hard to know what to say.
It's like I'm watching it, and it's almost like a train wreck, right? Or it almost like it's in slow motion, and you're thinking to yourself, why am I not saying anything?
Yeah. Yeah, and then even worse, it wakes you up at 3 a.m. Like, why didn't I say anything? You have this regret, and we need to be sleeping at 3 a.m. That's probably the 4th reason to be an upstander, is because if you don't, you feel bad about it. later. And I want people to feel good about themselves, right? So, and there's something leaders can do. I mean, that's an unusual story because usually what happens is nothing. Usually nobody knows what to do or say. So there's something that we as leaders can do to make it more likely that upstanders will stand up, which is to teach our teams to disrupt bias when we notice it. Come up with a shared vocabulary. What's the word or phrase that people will use when they notice bias? I, with my team, like to wave a purple flag. So that's our shared vocabulary. Other teams have used Daniel Kahneman's language from his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Some teams have said, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. That's a good I statement. One team I worked with had kind of a cat theme, and they meowed at each other. Whatever it is,
Okay.
that works for you and your team. But come up with a shared vocabulary, and then you also need to teach your team how to respond when they've said or done the bias thing, which we are all bound to do. Because again, when someone points out to me that I've said or done something biased, I feel deeply ashamed. And when I'm ashamed, my executive function goes to sleep and my lizard brain wakes up. Although I've just read there's no such thing as a lizard brain, but my worst instincts will say, wake up. And so what you as a leader need to do is to teach people how to manage their own shame. Because there's no way you can tell me that I've said or done something biased that's not going to trigger that shame response. The fault is not how you told me. I need to learn how to manage my own emotions in that moment. And so telling people to say, thank you for pointing it out. And one of two things, either I get it and I'm working on it, or I don't get it. Can you explain it to me after the meeting? And both of those things are pretty hard to say. I get it, but I did it anyway. Is hard to say. And this happened to me when I was writing Radical Respect. I asked someone to read the book and point out biased language that I might be using.
Okay.
And one of the things that her name is Breeze Harper, that Breeze pointed out to me is that I tend to use sloppy sight metaphors. I tend to say, I don't see, when what I meant is I don't notice. And that is sort of ableist language. And another one of the editors of the book is blind. And so the last thing, again, there's a practical reason I care about words and using the right words, but there's also an emotional reason. Zach Scherr helped me edit the book. He is blind. And the last thing I wanted to do was use language that was going to make him annoyed as he was reading the book or make him feel excluded. And so I thought I got it, and yet I did a quick search of the manuscript before I turned it in. And in a book that's 300 pages long, guess how many sloppy sight metaphors there were?
Unfortunately, probably more than you would have liked.
99. So I had not only had and so these habits of thought that are they're often deeply baked into the way we talk, and it's hard. It's really very difficult to change them. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but it does mean we need to be persistent. We need to be patient with ourselves. We need to extend ourselves and others some grace, but we need to be persistent in changing. Like there's another one that I've said since I was young that I am working very hard not to say anymore, which is that's lame. And what I mean is that's not cool, but these are like deeply ingrained habits of speech. And
that's so interesting. And also just as you're sharing this, I'm thinking to really surround yourself with people who are going to radical candor, right? Who are going to provide you kind of the mirror that
they're gonna hold
you
up
can
a mirror.
see. They're going to hold it up, right? Because
Right.
if we don't have that and we don't have the self-awareness, we'll never know. We're just going to continue to hurt people, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's an important aspect, or at least that's what I'm trying to get better at myself.
Yeah. Yeah, and to create an environment where people are rewarded for telling you, not where they don't fear that you're going to punish them. And also, but it's not just about them telling you about yours, because everybody on the team has these things. And so teaching people to correct them in the moment, to wave the flag in the moment, I think is really important. So this is a service that we're providing to each other. We're going to welcome it. We're going to thank each other for doing it. And then you need this shared commitment, because it's one thing, you can come up with the purple flag. You can come up with a thank you for telling me I'm working on it, or thank you for telling me, but I don't know what I did wrong. And that's also hard to say, because now I'm doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I hurt someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. But learning how to say this kind of over and over and over again, I think is really important. So you need this commitment to actually doing it. So that's one thing leaders can do to help change bias on their team, because bias is just a pattern. And as human beings, we are pattern makers. And sometimes we make good patterns, and sometimes we make bad patterns. And the only way to make more good patterns and fewer bad patterns is to point out the bad ones.
Absolutely. This is so good. And so here's what I'm going to suggest for all of you. There is so much to this book, Radical Respect, and the framework is very clearly defined. Trust me, there's plenty of 2x2s.
Yes.
And you're going to get, first of all, Kim, you do such a good job of sharing personal stories and anecdotes and things that actually happened to you,
yeah.
right? So you do
or that I
through,
did,
or that you did, right?
I did wrong.
Yeah, and which I think is so important, and it is what makes, it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier when you were talking about being able to tell stories, right? And the power of stories and how we then receive lessons from those stories.
Yes.
You do such a remarkable job in this book. So for all of you, we talked about Radical Candor, going out and buying a copy of that book. You have got to get Radical Respect as well. It is a perfect pairing to Radical Candor. But make sure that not only are you reading this material and that you're re-listening to this conversation, but apply the lessons in your own life and in your business. If there's no change, there's no change. Now that you have a bit more awareness around this, you can start to pay more attention. And then you have some tools in your toolbox that you can begin to put into practice. So please do yourself a favor and do that. Again, we're going to provide the link in the show notes. So Kim, as we are, first of all, you're such an incredible gift to all of us. I love the way your mind works. I love your personality. I love the fact that you're so authentic and you're just so relatable, and I truly appreciate that about you. So as we're wrapping up the conversation, I would love it, two things. Number one, if you would give us all a challenge, including me. What is something that you would challenge all of us to do starting immediately?
Yes, go out and solicit feedback from someone. Ask someone who works for you, what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? And if those words don't fall trippingly off your tongue, think of a better question. But ask them, and then reward them for the candor. Make sure that they know that not only will they not be punished, but they will be rewarded for telling you about your mistakes. That will make that's the most important first step you can take.
Beautiful. So good. And then my final question to you is this. I was going to ask you one question, but I think I'm going to ask you another one, just based on your personality and how open you've been during this conversation.
Great.
So what is one of the most difficult decisions that you've had to make in the pursuit of the person who you are today? Just one, the most difficult decision.
I think one of the most difficult decisions, and it's sort of silly looking back that it was so hard, but was to decide to leave my role as an operating executive and to sit down and to write the books that I wanted to write. because I had to walk away from stock options that were worth lots and lots of money to sit down and write a book that I didn't know if anybody would ever pay me a nickel to. In fact, when I told them that I was leaving in order to write this book, they didn't believe me. They're like, "You're doing what?" And so I think one of the most important things is not to get on the hedonic treadmill and start going after more and more and more, but to realize when you've got enough and now it's time to do the things you most want to do with your life.
Ooh, yeah. Anyone else on that treadmill?
Yeah, we're all on it.
I think we're all on it. Yeah.
Getting off that hedonic treadmill is really, really hard, but really important to living the life that you imagine.
That is so good, so true. So, Kim, thank you so very much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. What a phenomenal conversation. I love your insights, the way that you are willing to travel down different pathways to uncover great bits of wisdom. And thank you for sharing it in such an insightful way. The way that you articulate your messages are so clear. I love your stories. You're such a great personality. Thank you, and I'm grateful for you.
Thank you so much. Really loved the conversation with you. Great questions and great audience. Thanks to all of you all for listening.
That is so good. And for all of you, just like Kim said, thank you so much for watching and listening. And I do have a quick favor to ask. Would you please take just a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts? And a matter of fact, while you're leaving us a review, I'm going to link to Kim's podcast. Do exactly the same thing for her. That helps us all grow our podcast and be able to attract amazing guests. So if you would do that, we'd appreciate it. And to listen to more podcasts, all you need to do is visit jscherbusinessconsulting.com. Click that podcast button. And until next time, you just keep learning, keep growing. Make sure you run out to get a copy of Radical Respect. Apply the lessons you learn, and we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.